Now, when people do research, there's usually, it's because something's bothering them, you know, some questions on their mind. Either they're seeing something in the world that's causing them to get curious or troubled, or intellectually they're working through something, something's bothering them. So they dig in and they work on a piece of research. So let me just start by asking Brad, what was bothering you?
Well, as all of us probably know, there's a growing disconnect in American life between marriage and parenthood, both structurally. For instance, 41% of American kids now are born outside of marriage, and culturally. We've seen, for instance, in the Pew data, that a growing number of young Americans think that becoming a parent is not important for being a good spouse or having a successful marriage. So that kind of reality led Elizabeth and me to think about, you know, how can we kind of re-knit the connection between marriage and parenthood?
So the problem
Yes.
was
Disconnect.
disconnect between marriage
and parenthood.
and parenthood.
Right.
And being a scholar, you decided to approach this in a scholarly way. Okay, I want to just, I want to spend another minute
Sure.
framing the
Yeah.
framing this. And I want to tell just very quickly, you might not agree with this, what I believe is the kind of traditional story of parenthood. And it goes something like this. We human beings are hardwired to want to have offspring. With Aristotle, John Locke, to the evolutionary biology, they all say that this is a deep human need and desire to, as Aristotle said, leave behind something of ourselves. We humans have created an institution to make this possible and increase the likelihood of success in it. The institution is called marriage. When children that are this deep desire come out of the marital union, we view the birth of the child as a gift from God, for which we should be thankful for, and the more the better. And as the Bible says in Psalms 127, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Children are not only a gift, they're an investment, because you have to take care of them when they're dependent, but at a fairly early age, they start working for you and help you in your old age. So,
and we're all counting on that.
So we have this deep desire to reproduce. We've created this institution called marriage that makes it possible. And children are a gift for which we are thankful and a source of financial security as we age. I think that's the story. It's actually the story I grew up with. It's actually the one I still believe. But what's chipping away? I'm asking again, just tell me, there's something going on in the culture where that story is being challenged, it's open to revision, maybe some people just think it's a bad story, or there's something going on. I'm trying to figure out what it is that's caused you to do this research.
I love everything you just said, and I lean that way too. But I think we can all agree that there's been a growing sense that children are not necessarily a gift or just a gift, but they're also a choice, and that's a very loaded word. I don't know that we want to get into the debates about contraception and abortion rights and all that tonight, but those trends and those public discussions have been part of a larger pattern over the last few decades of women in particular seeing children and other life decisions as being a choice and not something that you just fall into. And I think one consequence is that we have seen this evolve alongside the soulmate model of marriage idea, this idea that marriage is first and foremost kind of a friendly and fun union between two people that's about sex and having a good time and being companions. The idea that it also responds in some practical way to the realities that heterosexual sex makes babies have kind of gotten sidelined, and we see that coming out in a lot of different debates right now, certainly the same-sex marriage debate and the movement, the single mom by choice movement, and the idea that I am so sure I do not wish to try to combine marriage and parenthood that I'll just go ahead and have a baby on my own some other way, either by.
So you're pointing to this trend, you're pointing to the same trend Brad said of the separation
of marriage and parenthood.
of marriage and
which we're seeing a lot
parenthood.
different.
So I may want to be a parent, but I may not want a spouse underfoot, or parenting is this really hard thing to do.
But I know I want to do it,
But
but I'm
I
not
know
so
it-
sure about marriage, which is also apparently really hard to do. I mean, I'm echoing what the mindset that I see.
Well, Amber and or David, I know that you're, there's the world of your social world that you're a part of, but there's also the world that you've been researching. How relate what's been said so far to what you're finding in the field or hearing about people in their 20s who are making these decisions about children and marriage?
Well, I was just going to say, to go off what Elizabeth said about choice, actually with the high school educated population that we were mainly interviewing, it seems like for them that they're not focusing on children as, they still see children as a gift. And that narrative that David was talking about, they still kind of hold on to that same narrative minus the marriage part. So marriage is no longer necessary, but children are the meaning of life and, what we're here to do, basically.
Children are great, but marriage,
Yeah, it's unrelated. It's good. They want to get married, but after they have children and can make sure that they can stay with this person.
These are, I guess you might say, these are blue-collar people from Middle
From
America.
a small town in Ohio.
Yeah.
As one working class young man told me, he said,
David, we need to speak to people in the back.
as one working class young man told me, he said, marriage is a couple thing. That's you and your lover. Children, that's an individual thing. That's something that you kind of negotiate on your own individual terms. That certainly wasn't the worldview espoused by everyone, but more or less, we did see that disconnect between marriage and parenthood that Brad was talking about.
See, because one of the things that you say in the beginning of the study is that there's a discussion, there's a kind of narrative out there that says having a child is going to be really hard on the marriage. So having a child makes you unhappy in your love relationship. And I felt like a grumpy old man when I read about this, because this is a new thought to me. I mean, I know that these things actually happen, but the idea that one would conceptually pull these two things apart and say, well, gee, what about one in the, you know what I mean? As opposed to thinking them as just one thing, that's new to me. I was like not aware that those articles that you cited and so on.
Right.
But
right.
You think the data are there, and you think the data are there that Americans in their 20s today are having the thought of, I'm pretty sure I want to have a child, but the relationship to the child to being married is either unclear or just...
Well, it's more attenuated. It's not entirely absent. But if you look at the survey data, what you're seeing is that more young Americans, basically expect that they'll become parents, and they're looking forward to that. It's a top priority. But having a successful marriage, it seems more and more unattainable for many Americans, and so they're not necessarily linking marriage and parenthood in ways that are congruent with what David and Amber just said. So that's part of the story here, is that people want to get married, they want to have kids, but they're more likely to think they can do the parenthood thing, and they're not as sure that they can do the marriage thing today.
Okay, so tell the people here the major findings of the study.
Want to hit the single parenthood piece first?
One of the things that was quite striking is that the desire for children, of course, is quite strong, but it's been focused in recent years on studies showing that marital quality can dip and after children come along. So people hear this and they think that kids make you less happy. One of the things that Brad and his colleagues did, and I joined them in this, was look at the data on how married mothers, for instance, he looked at fathers too, but how married mothers compare with cohabiting mothers and single mothers. on issues like happiness and depression and other measures like that. And one of the things that they found on this nationally representative survey data was that married mothers were, 50% of them said that they were very happy in their lives. Cohabiting mothers, 39% said they were very happy in their lives. Single moms, 25% said they were very happy in their lives. And so it was clear that
global happiness. I'm
global
a happy
happiness.
person.
Yeah, not talking about the marital quality so much, and we can get to that, and I know Brad will, but just global happiness, how I feel about my life in general. You know, the married moms were twice as likely as the single moms to feel that they were happy.
What about selection
with the
effects?
Cohabit, and he was controlling for.
And we control for differences in income and education, race, and
So
ethnicity.
the fact that the married people might be, say,
Coming
older,
from, yeah.
higher education, et cetera, you control for this. That means you
To
try
account,
try
yeah.
to take this into account, and you say that after one takes account of those so-called selection effects, that married mothers
And fathers too, right.
and married fathers are happier than single parents or cohabiting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a finding. And so, but do they become less happy after their child is born?
So yes, that's true, but I also want to just circle back to a point that Elizabeth has made in The Atlantic today. It's online, and she makes the point that there's this sort of whole narrative in a lot of TV shows and films, like The Backup Plan, for instance, that, you know, it's kind of, in a sense, almost easier to go it alone, you know, as a parent, and not have to worry about this whole marriage thing and, you know, negotiating with someone else about, you know, Saturday nights you mentioned in the piece, and, you know, Kate Royfield had this piece and Slate on that. But the point we're making is that for kind of the average American, that's entirely false. For the average American, it's much easier, emotionally speaking, to have a child in marriage rather than the alternatives. And it seems like common sense, but nevertheless, it's getting lost in the pop
It is,
culture.
and one of the things we're doing in this report is focusing actually on the emotional well-being of adults. A lot of our work here at the Institute, at least, tends to focus on child well-being. But this is actually takes seriously that we should, you know, consider and be concerned about the emotional well-being of adults, and looks at the fact that the single moms by choice making these kinds of decisions are not only, you know, freer and having more fun than their married peers, but actually are struggling more, which, and one can imagine why, but it seems like we need to have data to actually explain that.
Why do people become less happy after their child is born?
So the other finding that we're kind of grappling with
Besides being really tired. Sorry, go ahead.
is sort of looking in more detail at this widespread finding in the literature that particularly after the first child comes, it's kind of it's a shock to the system for the married couple. No offense, guys.
Not for them. They're immune to this.
Get ready for the big blow.
I know, I don't want to scare any. I'm so glad we have people who've already had children here.
But, you know, I mean, obviously you're getting less sleep, and there's more housework, there's more childcare to do. You're rearranging oftentimes your work schedules. There's just a lot of transitions and a lot of work to be done, and that's stressful. You know, stress is often a big contributor to declines in marital quality. So there's this big transition.
Stress because of
Any kind of
extra
stress.
work.
Yep.
Well, let's just push this a little further. Judith Wallerstein for many years has said that one of the things that happens is the new mother focuses most of her attention on the baby and less attention on the big baby. Sex life gets worse. He feels like he's no longer the center of her adoring attentions. This newcomer is.
Yeah.
And she says the seeds of divorce are often sown in the first year of the child's birth because of the dissatisfaction of the man for no longer being number one in the for his in his lover's eyes. True or false?
I think that's true to a degree. It's also the case that many women feel like their husbands, after the baby comes along, are kind of carrying on in the old way in terms of their focus on work and maybe their friends, and not sufficiently attentive to the baby and to them as a wife. So for both those reasons, that can be obviously a source of distress for couples. So what we're finding then on average is about 35% of married parents are very happy in their marriages today, compared to about 50% of married couples who don't have kids. That just gives you some sense of the difference, you know, in the population now in the U.S. There is a dip, but we also find that married parents, this goes to the subtitle, are more likely to report that their lives are meaningful. They have more purpose in their life compared to to childless couples. So they're kind of trading a bit of marital happiness for more meaning and purpose in life. That's one thing that we point out.
They're tired and a little grumpy, but they feel like there's a reason for them being here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the reason is this new life. And all right, so what's next?
And then the final thing that we do in the report is to identify.
By the way, Brad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean,
Right.
for people who don't know, these were 3 surveys, 3.
Well, there are two surveys that sort of allow us to compare single, cohabiting, and married parents on global satisfaction in life and on depression. And then the final survey is a new survey we have done with the funding from the Templeton Foundation called the Survey of Marital Generosity. That survey allows us to compare married parents and childless married couples, and then also to figure out what is linked to successful marriages among fathers and mothers today.
And this study is using data from all 3 of those
Exactly.
surveys.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Just a side thing. So, what's the next cluster of things you want to say?
Well, just that we are able to identify a kind of a number of different factors. We kind of call them almost kind of a neo-traditional model of marriage for our day that are associated with successfully being a married mother and father.
So wait a minute, these tired new parents who have a sense of meaning in life, 35% of them are say they're also happy as clams. And you're figuring out
right,
what's making these marriages thrive.
What can the rest of us learn from this?
What can the rest of us learn
who do not
from
have
this,
that dip
from the
after-
people
yeah.
who don't experience the post-child trough of unhappiness,
or who experience it but kind of
bounce back
yeah,
relatively quickly.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So so this is under the realm of new findings, right? You've got some things to say on this subject. What are those things?
Well, just to give you 3 of each, on the more kind of progressive end of things, we find that having a good sex life is very important for married parents. And obviously that can take a little while to restart after baby comes along. But the point is that the couple should kind of be attentive to that because it's a very important predictor of their marital happiness. A second point is that sharing housework and childcare among today's young married parents is also a predictor of on average, more successful marriages. And the third point is something
shared housework.
Right, and it's defined
It means,
subjectively.
like, you do the dishes and.
Could you? I think you need to go back and study that further. I'm just kidding.
I've heard stories.
And the third thing is we call marital generosity, and we'll talk about that more in a second because I want to expand on that. But those are kind of the 3 more newer things that we would say are associated with successful marriages for parents today. And then there are 3 traditional things. The first is shared commitment to one another. Since you're in this, together, it's us rather than just me and me. Second thing is shared religious faith. Couples who have the sense that God is present in their marriage, both husband and wife reporting this, are much more likely to succeed in their marriages. And the third thing is having the support of family and friends who support their marriage, not just them as individuals, but their marriage. Having friends and family who are kind of invested in their marriage is also a strong, kind of what we'd say is a more traditional predictor of succeeding in marriage today. So those are 6 of the factors that we associate today with successful marriages for young married parents in America today.
When you were doing your research or in any other way of knowing things, do you have thoughts about this drop in marital happiness after the child's birth? Is that something that you just learned about by reading the report, or was this something that was in your mind as researchers or as married? Was this an idea for you?
And let me just piggyback too on that. In terms of also thinking about couples that you knew in Ohio who were cohabiting and then had that baby, I'm wondering if the stresses associated with parenthood proved to be particularly problematic for them because they didn't have all the legal and the social and moral supports that we associate with marriage. in that transition to parenthood.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, well, we certainly did see, I'm thinking of one cohabiting couple that we interviewed. When we interviewed them in the first summer, she was pregnant, and then when we talked to them just this past summer, they had their child, but they were no longer together. They weren't mad at each other, as far as we know, and they maintained friendly relations, but they weren't together. And so, and both of them, they didn't, she was working, they had different schedules where she was working from like 6 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock at night. He was working
Were they
a
living
different
together?
schedule. They were living together, yes. But we kind of saw how who knows what all contributed to them breaking up after the birth of their child. Well, actually, they broke up before the birth of their child. But just Amber and I had, since the birth of our child, I think we have a greater appreciation for a lot of the, just the daily life challenges that you face, especially if, for instance, you don't have a lot of flexibility with your job. I mean, if you have to be at work every day at 6 o'clock and you have to be, and there's not a lot of flexibility with the employer. I mean, that takes its toll on somebody who's pregnant and they're expecting, and especially then when the baby comes along. And
especially if you have complications, as several of the young women that I interviewed, they had something like preeclampsia or, something that made it so that they were in the hospital longer. And if their husband cannot get off work, if he's working at Wendy's or McDonald's or whatever, that's much more stressful than if you have some flex time.
Right. So I guess before we had it, and when we were doing the research, really, we knew that having a child could be difficult and involves challenges, and we were hearing that from the people. But then when we went through it, we really kind of gained real knowledge of that and a newfound appreciation for the challenges of people, especially people with fewer resources, and also not
Less
as much
control over their schedule.
less control over the schedule, and also not as much support from their families for their relationships, whether it's cohabiting relationships or it's a marriage.
Part of that is because a lot of these people come from divorced homes themselves,
Yes.
where their parents are working crazy schedules just to make ends meet for themselves, and the parents don't have the resources to help out their children and their grandchildren. A lot of them would do childcare and things like that if they could, if the grandma doesn't have to work. But in response to your question, Brad, I was actually surprised that we didn't get more of a sense that people said, oh, after we had children, it was stressful. I think we saw that happen. We saw them have children, and then the financial stress and other things contributed then to a breakdown in the relationship. But the people we talked to valued children so much that they would never want to say anything that sounds like they're regretting their children or blaming them, or
Unlike New York Magazine writers who are quite
Right.
happy to blame their children.
Yeah, those poor
And those-
souls.
we were more likely to hear, oh, it made our relationship closer. I mean, I talked to people who would say, oh, no, after the child was born, we felt so close and blah, blah, blah. But then it's more when they have these challenges later
Sure, or
on.
even they would say, even if they had a very messy breakup, and they had a child with that former partner, they would say things, but I would do it all over again because I have my baby.
Or they would say, but I still love him because he's the father of my precious children, but I just don't want to be married to him. Things like that.
And there have been a number of these surveys about cohabiting, people who are, have a love relationship and often living together at the time the child is born, and they have aspirations to build a life together, but they don't, by and large. They just don't. The fathers are gone within a matter of several years in most cases. Goodbye, father. So one question I had in reading the report, traditionally anthropologists and others have told us that there is a, after the child is born, there is a redefinition of gender roles often along more traditional lines.
Right.
That if you have had the first few years of your marriage
Sure.
as two completely equal individuals, kind of living very
Right.
similar lives and so forth, and then the child comes along and the perceived logic or the perceived pressure or some structure causes, you know, well, dear, I'm off to work, have a good day with the baby, and, you know, or some differentiation in
Sure,
gender
right.
roles, that this can cause people, well, it's just a big fact.
Mm-hmm.
True or false?
It's still true to a degree. What's new, as I mentioned before, is that there's kind of an assumption among young married parents today that husbands and wives are basically going to share housework and childcare. And I think there's a kind of flexible, you know, understanding of how that works in practice. But the ideal is sharing in some meaningful way, however they kind of break it up. But when it comes to paid work, for married parents in America today, the vast majority of husbands would prefer to work full-time, and a clear majority of married mothers would prefer to work part-time. And so when it comes to paid work outside of the home, there's a bit of a, you know, of a gender difference there. And one of the things that we find in the report is that married women who have kids in the household and are working more hours than they would prefer to are less happy in their marriages. And that speaks, I think, in part to your point just a moment ago about, you know, in the wake of having this child in their life, they would like to kind of oftentimes step back to a degree from work, and if they're working full-time, that can be, and you know, unwillingly, that can be a source of tension for, I think, for them in their roles as mothers and as wives.
If there's possibility to answer this from the data, please do so. If not, just say what you think. If I'm in my 20s and I'm married, and I want to know the one or two things to make my marriage be a happy, thriving one. You know, what are the one or two things that I hope I can have that are likely to be, you know, mean that I'll be with my spouse in 50 years and we'll be happily getting old together? What are those one or two things?
Well, I think, judging by the data, I would say actually just three things, and quickly. One is that sense of commitment, that sense of, you know, we are in this together, and kind of come what may, I'm going to be there for my spouse. The second thing is marital generosity, and I'll say more about that in a second. And the third thing, you know, I think, is being plugged into a community. You know, it could be a religious community, or it could be a community of friends and family members who really support you as a married couple.
All right, so let's break those down.
Sure.
First is commitment.
Commitment, right.
Well, I want to push a little harder on that, because I'm sure
Right.
everybody feels committed
Right.
in their relationship.
Right.
Commitment to the idea of marriage itself.
Well, no, actually, no, we measure it in a couple of ways in the report. And one of the things that we do is we ask people to think about if they view their relationship more in terms of us or more in terms of me. And so if they say it's about us, that's one indicator of commitment. Another is where they're asked to basically say, you know, they're going to be with their spouse kind of come what may. We don't specifically mention divorce. And then a third dimension of commitment
So
is...
the more people say, this is it, no matter what,
Yes.
that's a predictor.
And the other piece of this is
vow
they're not...
of marital permanence,
and they're not-
as they say.
They're foreclosing other opportunities. They're really closing down their sight to other opportunities, romantic opportunities in their social environment. Those three things are dimensions of commitment.
Number two is,
Generosity.
okay, how do I know if I'm watching a couple who has a generous marriage? If I'm just watching them shop or put the baby to bed or argue about money, how do I know that I'm watching a couple that has marital generosity?
Can I use an example that I heard you tell me one time?
Yes.
So David was visiting some kind of colleagues out west, staying in their home, and he remarked to me that he observed a conversation between a husband and wife in the kitchen one morning that was kind of an extended conversation and very calm and very kind. And what he eventually realized is that in the conversation, the husband was seeking to borrow the wife's car that day. But the husband didn't say, I need your car, honey, or are you busy, I gotta take the car. But there was a other-oriented finding out how she was, how she felt about this whole thing, respecting the fact that this was
Craig
her
and Debbie
car.
Carden, you were there too.
Wonderful supporters of the Institute, who I believe have a very generous marriage. And that's the kind of example that comes to my mind. And one of the things that I think is so fresh about Brad's insights here about generosity is that those of us, you know, I'm a 1970. I grew up in an era when, you know, marriage was talked about. It was, you know, it was about how do you get what you need out of your marriage, you know. And at best, it was like marriage is a lot of work, and who wants to sign up for that? But when I engage with Brad's findings and what he has to say about that a spirit of generosity and forgiveness is not surprisingly linked to a more lasting and happier marriage. And this can be little stuff, as he often says, you know, the bringing of coffee to your spouse or the how are you after a hard day. Which
So the ungenerous guy, this is a wonderful couple. I had forgotten that I mentioned that story, but a less than generous way of doing it would be, hey, could I borrow your car today? And then the other one says, well, you know, this will be the third time this week, and this is an inconvenience.
it's like, well, I
no,
really
don't you
need
know,
it.
I really need it.
Yeah.
It would be that kind of a conversation.
Right. Like
Okay.
you might see in my house sometimes on one of our less good days.
Never,
My
never
husband
in-
and I share a car, so we have these conversations a lot. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah,
So the idea of 50-50
Is bad, yeah.
Not 50-50 is not
100,
good.
yeah.
50-50 bargaining over
Yeah,
who's
keeping
getting
tabs.
the good things
Yeah.
and who's having to do the hard work. All right. So
But it's for both people to do this because this is an
Right,
ethic
so one of
that
the
has
ideas,
been a
too, I think, is-
particularly
is-
feminine one.
no, I think it
and
was
then
just for
feminine-
mostly the women to do. I
No,
definitely thought that was the
in page
deal.
76, it
Ah.
says men too. Yeah,
Ah,
you have to,
I-
yeah,
okay.
yeah, so, yeah.
That generosity stuff.
Yeah.
We have
You gotta just
animals
dig
to
deep.
kill.
No, but you can do that and be generous
Okay,
about it.
all right.
And then the third point is simply
Poor Brad.
is about community. And I think we often, you know, as Americans don't realize how much our relationships, you know, our romantic relationships, even more so our marriages, depend upon, are more likely to flourish if we're situated in the right communities. And that, I think, comes out in the report too, either in terms of a religious context or in terms of a good family and friendship context. And if you have those kinds of community supports for your marriage, you're more likely to succeed. And if you don't, you're not.
Can I share an anecdote
Yeah,
about that?
yeah.
Before Amber and I, when Amber was pregnant, sometimes my mom, who's actually sitting in the back there, sometimes she would ask us, oh, you know, so do you think you guys are going to want to have, help, you know, during the first, do you want me to be there? Do you want Amber's mom to be there? How do you think you guys are going to want to do that?
And I was like, no, I think we just want to have like our own little
family
family
time.
bonding.
You know? It's our time to bond as a family.
I was serious. I was serious.
We were serious. We were completely serious. And then I think about a month, about the 9th month of
That's what I was
pregnancy.
thinking.
Yeah, about a month before the baby was born, we finally wised up. We said, oh, we should probably have.
It was in our birthing class, and we were kind of imagining everything and like taking home a baby, and then we were like, oh wait, actually we don't know the first thing, yeah. how
Well,
to take care of a
regardless to
baby.
say, I mean, we were a week in the hospital after the birth, and if my mother would not have been there, I mean, she was an extraordinary help. And then we had her mom fly in from Ohio to help for a week, and then we had there's several young married couples in our neighborhood where we live, and they were bringing meals and.
Basically, in the
were-
last month and a half, I think I've made less than a handful of meals, like for the
Yeah.
whole month and a half. So,
I can't
we've
imagine.
had wonderful,
we
yeah.
cannot imagine having Daniel without all of that support. I mean,
You know,
it's-
It's still hard.
Okay,
Yeah.
relate this, if you want to, relate it to the research in the Middle America research, because I'm just curious, or maybe Brad or Elizabeth, you have things to say about this too, the difference in the support levels between married and cohabiting. In other words, is there a difference
Yeah.
between I'm reminded of my friend Bill Raspberry once said, I would lend money to my son-in-law, I would never lend money to my daughter's boyfriend. And he meant it. You know, so I'm wondering if that is an older notion or whether that's still there. That is, the anthropologist will tell you historically that the marriage doubles the support network for the mother and the infant. If the mother and the infant are on their own, they have who they have. If the mother is married, the support network doubles by virtue of the marriage. That's the old story. So I'm asking you if the new story you're looking at now bears any or no resemblance to that.
I think for us, the people who were married that we talked to were more likely college educated. We didn't talk to very many like high school educated people who were also married. Most of them were cohabiting. And so I'm not sure if this is related to the marriage or to the kinds of the kinds of communities they were in. But a lot of the high school educated people who were cohabiting that we talked to, like I said before, a lot of their family are divorced, or it just seems like there were a lot of tensions in those families. Whereas the married couples that we talked to, it seemed like they were more likely to be plugged into either some sort of church or place of worship, or to have parents that were still together. Although for a lot of those people, their parents lived in other parts of the country, so they didn't have that support either. So I don't know, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on Amber's point, one of the things that we noticed in the report last year is that these sort of webs of social support, both religious and secular and familial, like you're talking about, are much more attenuated in working class and poor communities. So that just adds to this kind of distress and this kind of instability that we're
You know,
seeing.
when we at the Institute first got into the kind of family structure debate some years ago, the common thing would be we would say, oh, you know, marriage is not a bad idea. People would say, oh no, it's not the marriage. You know, single parents can do fine as long as they have a support network.
Right.
Well, where do these support networks come from?
Right.
You know,
Right.
there is no such thing as some support network out there. What there really are single parents who tend to be much more isolated and alone than married parents. And so
One of our Family Scholars bloggers, Amy Zitler, who's here tonight, had this wonderful, touching anecdote about going to her children's school, and another child, everyone had drawn pictures of their family, and one child had drawn a picture of her family, a big, big red sea of crayon, and in there, and two pennies, Amy said, was my mom and me. You know, and that to me was just one of the most poignant examples I'd heard of, you know, whereas other kids, you know, it was the fathers and mothers were bigger than the kids and arching over them, and there were birds and flowers and sun shining, and just this one little girl, me and my mom, you know.
yeah, well, they you know, all the studies say that the most intimate and enduring bond in the human species is the bond between the mother and the child. This is the one relationship that almost cannot be broken. But the cultural institutions that we have constructed to surround and support and cause that relationship to thrive and sort of reach its full potential, it seems like that's what's being called into question, right? It's not, I want to have a child. It's this other thing, that it's bringing the father into the relationship in a way that lasts, and it's creating an institutional framework that causes people to feel that they're thriving, that they have a sense of purpose, and that they're happy. I'm going to use the word, you know, so.
I want to add
Yeah.
to that too as well, that a lot of times I think in places like New York and in college-educated circles, when we talk about growing out of wedlock rates among high school educated and people without a high school education, the solution the envisioned solution to me, seems to usually be, oh, well, just go to college and just, you know, try not, you know, get on contraception and try not to have a child until you're about 30, you know. And become more blue state, in other words, that's another way of putting it, or become more like the college-educated elites. That's the solution.
Become more like the people who are dispensing this advice.
Yes. I think I think that would be a solution that would deny the integrity and the kind of the integrity of their lives and of the good of the desires for children that these people. I mean, these are very and we see in the data. People in their 20s, yes. And we see in the data that it's a great source of meaning for a lot of people, young parents included. So to me, I think we need to find ways to help these young 20-somethings need to stress the importance of commitment and need to show that marriage is something that can add stability to their lives, at least a good understanding of marriage can add stability to their lives, and then also look at ways how employers can help them. Something like a family wage or family leave time. Ways that we can support these families, not just say, no, bad desire, don't do it. How can we help them?
So you're saying that for you, the implication of thinking about the transition to parenthood is the need for more structured support from the community.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
I have an anecdote about that actually from my research. There was one couple that we got to know fairly well over the 2 summers that we did our interviews, and we spent time with them at a country, like a dance club where they had line dancing and country music, because that's just the kind of thing that people in this town would like to do. And we had a lot of fun with them, and they ended up getting married, and they were pregnant at the time. I got a text one morning from the woman, and she was so excited. And but the next summer, when we went back, they weren't together, and they were working on getting a divorce, and they were seeing other people, and part of it, a huge part of it, and we had gone to their wedding, and even at the wedding, we noticed that they didn't have much support from their families. Even at the wedding, the dad was joking about divorce and how this was a bad idea, and they had asked us to videotape.
Just wanted to get them off to a good start.
Yeah, well, and everybody just had a kind of negative attitude. It was a barbecue in a park, so it was a simple wedding, but they asked us to videotape it. So we were going around and asking people questions like, give some advice to the young married couple, and almost all of the advice was basically, don't do it, don't get married.
Whether jokingly or serious.
Yeah, I mean, it was like kind of in a joking but half serious sort of manner.
Humor that has a little bite to it.
Right, and the family, like the family, they were divorced, and so there's the mom or the stepmom and the dad, and then just a lot of tension. And the parents didn't like the husband, which, when we heard the story, was basically why their relationship didn't work, was because there wasn't a lot of support, and they had to live with the woman's parents, but they didn't like the husband. So how long can you live with your in-laws if they don't like you,
Well, that, I think particularly thinking about the issue of the institutional supports, that's maybe a good transition for us to switch to questions.